غرباء 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 غرباء
The hijab. The next man on the right is Sam Harris, the first to release what we call the new atheist literature called The End of Faith. The purpose for his release of this book was actually 9/11. He is also a harsh Islamophobe. He believes that nuking some parts of the Middle East might be justified. He also believes that torture is justified, and he believes that racial profiling of Muslims is also justified. The man on the far right that looks like Santa Claus is Daniel Dennett. He is a philosopher of science. He's the only philosopher of the group. He's not very well known. He tends to be the nicer one of them, so he doesn't get much publicity as a result of that. But he's written much on cognitive science. None of these gentlemen, for lack of better words, knows what they're talking about. And the reason for that is that they are stemmed in a certain belief system that we call scientism. This man is Victor Stenger. He's also another one of the new atheists, and he describes the belief as such. Excuse me. He wrote the book, The New Atheism, Taking a Stand for Science and Reason. It's a recent book. And he writes, perhaps the most unique position of new atheism is that faith, which is belief without supportive evidence, should not be given the respect, even deference, it obtains in modern society. Faith is always foolish and leads to many of the evils of society. Theists' argument that science and reason are also based on faith is specious. Faith is belief in the absence of supportive evidence. Science is belief in the presence of supportive evidence. He goes on to say, the non-atheist group seems to think that God is immune from being studied by the objective, rational methods of science. The new atheists firmly insist that the personal Abrahamic God, Islamic as well, is a scientific hypothesis that can be tested by the standard methods of science. This is the primary belief held by new atheists. Let's forget about all the arguments for evil and why religious people are bad and wars and all these other such things that you read in their screeds. This is the primary belief that they use to justify their stance, is that the belief in God can be tested by contemporary scientific methodology. And if it cannot, then it's irrational to believe in. These gentlemen here you should know very well. Anybody can tell me who they are? Zakir Naik is one of them. Who's the other one? Harun Yahya. Also known as Adnan Akhtar, right? Okay. These gentlemen fall right into the trap of the new atheist. They promote something called scientific commentary of the Quran, which is based on the belief that it's possible in some way to find in the Quran either precise revelations concerning scientific problems or passages indicating that scientific discoveries that have revolutionized the modern world are anticipated in the Quran. Thank you very much. The reason I'm showing you this, much better now. This is actually a very popular belief in the Muslim world today, and especially in Singapore and Malaysia as well. Some of you in this audience may actually believe this, that there are scientific miracles in the Quran. This has also been a very effective dawah tool by both Zakir Naik and Adnan Akhtar. They've used this in several of their lectures, and they have asserted quite confidently that the Quran predicts contemporary scientific discoveries. In a way, then, they are actually responding to the new atheists by asserting that there is, in fact, evidence for belief in God, and especially in Islam. What I want to say is that this is an incorrect position. I want to go on to say that this is product of of the same belief system that's causing Muslims to become atheists today. And the reason for that is that when they read people like Adnan Akhtar and Zakir Naik, and they begin to actually discover what science actually says about the subject, they tend to then find that there are errors in the Quran itself and the revelation, and therefore then they become atheists as a result. Please. Nice. That's fine. Again. Okay, so what is scientism? This is a very prolific belief in contemporary society. This is not a made-up word. It's existed since the 20th century. It was coined by Friedrich Hayek, a philosopher and economist. It is the belief that the methods of natural science, or the categories and things recognized in natural science, form the only proper elements in any philosophical or other inquiry, or basically that science is the only way to know truth. Whether you like it or not, everyone in this room is somehow affected by this belief. Every day we face the media, when we read magazines, when we read the news, we hear about the latest scientific discovery as though it is the most objective fact that has been discovered. That science itself is not prone to error, that scientists themselves are in fact the arbiters of all truth and what goes on in society. Can you do something? Excuse me? Oh, it's going to be a little bit more. Okay. Because I was going to get into that in the story. No, okay, it's fine. Scientism was actually coined in the 20th century by Friedrich Hayek. It actually comes from the French term scientisme, and it was used particularly at first against the fallacy of reasoning. Some people were trying to use the natural sciences to try to base objections or facts regarding like sociological or historical theories. So for instance, they would take the biological sciences, like the theory of evolution or something, then they would apply it to historical circumstances, and they would say, okay, human civilization acted a certain way because they evolved from this point or this point. This is a very vague example, I'm not trying to get too descriptive here. But essentially, scientism is just, you take the biological sciences or the physical sciences and you apply them to every field of study, music, art, literature. That is what scientism is. Please, have one. So I want to discuss the history of this belief system. Where did scientism begin? Okay, in the 1920s, there was a group of Austrians and Germans. And they got together in Vienna, and they called themselves aptly the Vienna Circle. This group also came to be called the logical positivists. I don't know if you're familiar with these individuals, but they were basically a group of mathematicians, scientists, and actually only one philosopher. The logical positivists had a cult following around one particular individual by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein. This man pictured here, in a very frizzy fashion, was actually an eccentric young man who eventually became a grammar teacher because he believed that after writing about 30 pages of philosophy, he had solved all philosophical problems. He was quite arrogant. And during the First World War, he was, when he was on off duty, he wrote several journals and tried to get them published. When nobody was interested, he put them in his backpack and had them forgotten. Eventually, he was then captured by enemy troops, and while in prison, he managed to smuggle out those two manuscripts to another philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell, who later then did have them published, and he eventually earned his PhD. Ludwig Wittgenstein had basically solved all the problems of logic. And what I mean by that is that he basically asserted that logic was only a bunch of symbols. They had no content whatsoever, and this formed the basis for what we now consider computer science. One of his main philosophical points was that the right method of philosophy would be this: to say nothing except what can be said, the propositions of natural science, something that has nothing to do with philosophy. And then always, when someone else wished to say something metaphysical, meaning something philosophical, to demonstrate to him that he had given no meaning to certain signs in his propositions. Basically, what he's saying here is that no statement that you make at all, every statement that you make, has no meaning whatsoever unless it can be verified by science. So whatever you say has to have scientific proof for it to have any sort of meaning. That's what he believed. Now, I want to ask the audience if you know if there's a problem with this statement. Anybody like to volunteer? Okay, well, before we go on, this philosophy of his, the logical positivist, lasted for about 40, 50 years. Until the 1960s, it was defeated by the same man, who eventually found out that he did not figure out all the problems in philosophy. In fact, he had screwed up very badly. And the reason why, could you please go to the next slide, is because of this statement right here. No statement has meaning unless it can be verified by science. What was that?
This statement can be verified by science.
Thank you. Can you click the next one, please? Next. And one more. Okay, yeah. So that was the main problem with the statement. So the entire philosophy that built around him for the past 50 years crumbled to pieces on this basis alone. Can you please go to the next slide? Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the not so flattering picture. This is Willard Quine. That's not where scientism ended, though. That was just one of the punches that I had to receive. The second major problem was from an American by the name of Willard Quine, who said that the totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges. I will explain this, by the way. Or to change the figure, total science is like a field or force whose boundary conditions are experience, a conflict with experience of the periphery occasions readjustments in the interior of the field. Okay, Quine was an American pragmatist. Basically, he believed that nothing was really useful unless it worked. So you can't make truth claims unless it actually does something. And what Quine basically said about the logical positivist is that, okay, you want to say that you can only verify things with scientific evidence. Things only have meaning with scientific evidence. But meaning itself is a whole web of knowledge. Okay? Not one statement can be meaningful, because one statement is always contextualized by what? Another statement, or another word, or another letter, or something like this. And a good example that he used was that the statement that I have to go to the locksmith today before work. This is a statement that he used. It's a very simple statement. I have to go to the locksmith before I go to work. But what does that mean? I have to go to the locksmith. In order to understand that, I have to know what a lock is. Why do I have to go to the locksmith? Something's broken. What is the concept of broken? What does that mean? Why do I have to have a lock on my house? Why do I have to go before work? Why is it that there's a time for me to go to work? See, so all of these things, this whole entire world, this coherent web of knowledge is what actually contextualizes and makes things meaningful. So in fact, what Quine was trying to say, in a nutshell, was that there was no such thing as an objective fact of science. In fact, what made science meaningful was the theories that we construct around it. Do I need to explain further? No? Okay. Just in case, we have certain theories that we follow in scientific literature. For instance, we have the theory of the Big Bang, we have the theory of Darwinian evolution. I know some of you in here are probably very much skeptics of that. That's fine, but just as an example, these theories are constructed to understand the data that we receive, to make it coherent. But the data that we receive does not interpret the theory itself. It's actually the theory. So in fact, science is not based on experience. Science is based on us constructing models for us to understand our own experiences. That's it. So science is not objective, it's subjective. It's completely and utterly subjective. There is no such thing as scientific fact. Now you may ask, okay, then how do we come up with all this technology? How can we come up with all these vaccines? How do we come up with all these scientific discoveries? There are in fact facts at a very base level. Meaning they're very consistent norms that we can discover based on the models that we have. But once we start to, can you go to the next slide? Sorry. Once we start to have problems with these models, we reach this man right here, another American, unfortunately, I'm sorry, by the name of Thomas Kuhn. He is also known as the Heidegger of the United States. I don't know if you're familiar with Heidegger, but Thomas Kuhn was considered his equal in the sense of how he changed philosophy in the West. Thomas Kuhn was actually first, I believe, a historian of science, and then he became a philosopher of science afterwards. He attended one of Quine's lectures in the same university, and then modeled his theories onto his own. The word paradigm, are you familiar with that term, was invented by this man. The word paradigm shift, the term paradigm shift, was also invented by this man. Now what Thomas Kuhn said was that we construct paradigms, or these models of reality, that make our experiences coherent. Afterwards, we start to experience anomalies. Basically, the theories start to get a little shaky. We can't really figure out how to include new experiences inside of it. And then we start to restructure the theory. We start, okay, well, maybe something's wrong here, let's move this over here. And we start to restructure it some more. We start to restructure it some more until it becomes so unstable that we have something called a paradigm shift. And what happens is that usually in history, a young scientist comes along who's a rebel and decides to go, okay, this whole theory here is wrong. And the old scientists who are embedded in that theory because their paychecks depend on it, and other such things such as politics and everything else, say, no, you're wrong, you're a heretic, and we're going to, disband you from our crew. Eventually the new scientific theory catches on as a result of the fact that the old scientists die off, and this is just a fact. Some of them do convert reluctantly and then say, we've known this all along. And then they make this myth that there was a progress from one theory to another. A good example of this was the Ptolemaic system and the Copernican system. First, we had the system where we believed that everything rotated around the Earth. That was actually a very nice system. It worked very well. If you actually research the history of this system, it was marvelous. It was so magnificently done. And every little problem that they ran into with the eclipses, everything like this, they just easily solved. It was just very, very complex. Now, why did Copernicus win in the day? Because his theory was more simple. That's it. Not because it was true, but because it simply solved the problems in a much more simpler fashion. Now, eventually, of course, we did confirm through direct experience that Copernicus was correct. But the reason for the theory's construction in the beginning had nothing to do with truth. It had everything to do with the fact that it was easier to solve the problems. And that is how science has worked since day one. Please. Okay, so if science is not objective, if science is not an objective perspective of reality, if it's all based on theory construction, if it's all based on subjectivity, then how is it that the new atheist philosophers and scientists today are able to make the claims that they do, and that God is a hypothesis? Well, first I want to start off with this man right here named Antony Flew. He's a very dashing Englishman. He died recently after he converted to deism. He did eventually believe in God, but he was one of the most famous atheists for about 50 years. Antony Flew came up with a theory redefining atheism in a way that would allow it to escape the burden of proof. And what I mean by that is that he redefined atheism. Now, when you think of an atheist, the typical definition that comes up is someone who believes God does not exist. Is this correct? This is not what Antony Flew believed. Antony Flew believed that the proper definition for an atheist was somebody who lacked a belief in God. Now that doesn't sound very different, but if you think about it, it's actually quite different. Someone who lacks a belief is not the same as somebody who believes that God does not exist. Somebody who lacks a belief is somebody who either lacks awareness or somebody who is simply not convinced. When he changed this definition, he changed the burden of proof, and he put it directly on the people who believe in God. At the same time, he came up with a principle called the Stratoko principle. I'm not going to explain where that name comes from, it's a Greek term. Where he said that the only way that we can explain things is if we start from the natural world. And the reason why is because this is all we have. And that was his basic reasoning. He believed that the supernatural could only be understood if started from the natural realm. Now, while he did eventually come to believe in God based on what he considered to be scientific evidence, and I don't agree with him as to why he came to believe in God, but you know. This principle would continue to be used by another philosopher that attended one of his lectures in a Canadian university in Toronto. Please. By the name of George Smith. Now, before we get into this, I want to tell you that this is the man that is responsible for all of the problems today with the new atheist. He is the backbone for all the new atheist literature. He is the backbone for all the new atheist ideas. But when he borrowed from Antony Flew, he also improved upon his original thesis. So when the atheist is seen as a person who lacks belief in a God, it becomes clear that he is not obligated to prove anything. The atheist, qua atheist, does not believe anything requiring demonstration. The designation of atheist tells us not what he believes to be true, but what he does not believe to be true. If others wish for him to accept the existence of God, it is their responsibility to argue for the truth of theism. But the atheist is not similarly required to argue for the truth of atheism. Next, please. And this is where we get into the problem. The theist digs his own hole, I'm sorry, that's a typo, from which there is no escape. He creates a problem by demanding an explanation for the natural universe, but now, having destroyed the context in which explanation is possible, he denies to himself the possibility of ever solving the problem. All the arguments for the existence of God that you've ever heard, the cosmological argument, the design argument, all of these mean nothing to these atheists, because for them, if it cannot be scientifically proven, it doesn't mean anything. If it is not backed by contemporary scientific literature, if there is not a scientific journal that says God exists, they will not accept. And the basis of all explanation must start from the natural universe itself, and that is it. The structure of each argument entails an inference from the natural to the supernatural, which in terms of human knowledge means an inference from the knowable to the unknowable. The concept of God actually negates the possibility of explanation. This actually sounds quite logical, if you really think about it. I mean, we have a starting point. This is our world that we live in. We believe in Islam that we cannot see the unseen. We believe in science of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the natural world. So in a way, we already agree with this. Somewhat. Is there how many more stuff? Okay, and we're not getting there yet. I'm going really too fast, right?
Yes.
Yes. Actually, there's a lot more to explain here, but so the new atheists have adopted this scientism. Now, first I want to explain, okay, what happened? If scientism was defeated around the 1960s and 70s, then why is it the case that there are atheists now who are claiming that science is the only way to know things? If scientism was defeated in the 1960s and 70s by the pragmatist movement, if it was destroyed completely, then why is it that atheists now are still using this concept? Well, that can be explained through education. There has been a massive gap in philosophy, academia, and the lay people in the past 40, 50 years. That's number one. Number two, it has been always very fashionable to see science as an objective guide to truth among the lay people. And most of the lay people are the ones that are converting to atheism, not the philosophers. The philosophers are actually staying within their own realms. They've already advanced beyond this. But because of that gap, it's very difficult for these ideas to be promulgated among the majority of society. One more point I want to bring up too as well. In regards to scientism, the reason that that Muslims were following people like Harun Yahya and Zakir Naik are falling away from the religion is on the basis that they see science as a scientific objective, as an objective truth. If we start to reform that understanding and see science as more of a subjective thing, theoretical construct, and get them away from this understanding of the Quran also as being dependent on science. I made this point in my thesis, and actually my advisor told me to take it out because it was too strong, but I still think it's appropriate to say this. But for me, it is almost a sign of kufr, or when somebody uses the Quran and tries to prove it with science. I'm sorry, it's a sign of kufr. Unintentional, I'm not going to claim that for somebody, but if somebody says that the Quran has to be proven by scientific inquiry, they're saying that a man's theoretical constructs must prove the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in fact, when you see these arguments, not only are they unstable, but they are completely outside of our religion. And I don't mean that as an insult to any of you here who have followed that sort of understanding of the faith or tried to prove Islam through those means. But I will tell you this, you will feel very foolish in 10 to 20 years when that theory that you were using to prove the Quran changes. Because it will. Quantum physics is already changing the concept of the Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory is now obsolete if you read current physicist literature. The concept of evolutionary theory is also changing quite rapidly, and that soon will also be replaced. All of these concepts that you have in mind, that if you believe science is this objective, static way of truth, you are actually hurting yourself in your own faith. And in fact, you're hurting other people around you that you might be trying to bring to Islam. Because the moment that they say, oh, the Quran talks about this miracle and this and science, and then the moment they find out that's not the case, they will leave. The retention rate in the United States for converts is 40%. In the United States, out of all converts, 60% leave the religion in 1 year. And I tell you, the reason for that is because of this sort of dawah. And all they have to do is go online and argue with an atheist for 10 minutes, and they will be disproven in a moment. Okay. So, the prolific belief in society that is causing all of this to happen is the concept of scientism. In order to stop this from happening, what we need to do first off is we need to change our concept of science, and we need to change the concept of science for our brothers and sisters. I also have a theory which I'm trying to work on right now that I'm hoping to publish in a paper, is that you're all aware of the golden age of Islam? Of all the scientific discoveries? Okay. My theory is that the reason that those scientific discoveries occurred to begin with was because the Muslims at that time didn't read scientific miracles in the Quran. They were free to discover the science because they didn't read it in the Quran itself. That's the reason why they were able to do it. And the reason for the stagnation today of the Muslim world in science is because now we're adopting this concept. And assuming that the Quran has already these answers here. When in fact the Quran tells us to research, it tells us to look outside. The Quran is not a science textbook. It never has been. And in fact, Imam al-Shatibi said himself, there was a time when people were actually trying to promulgate this belief. I don't recall the exact date. You could probably help me with that. Huh? Imam Shatibi. Maliki scholar. there was a time when there was a group of ulama who were trying to say there were scientific principles in the Quran. There was actually a time when this actually occurred. I think it was around the 12th to 13th century CE. And even seen yet, that they had no knowledge of. He said, you were trying to tell me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed something to the Arabs that they would be completely confused about. So, it's a very short time. So this is not my main argument, actually. I've actually constructed, based on this research, and I'm giving you a very brief and concise version of things. But based on my research, I actually came up with one argument that, in my opinion, does prove the existence of God. And it's based off this understanding right here. I have taken the atheist argument and I've turned it around, and I hope it works. I've tested it, and so far I haven't had any major objections. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to explain that. I'm going to make this more concise in the future for publication reasons, but for right now, I want to explain this, and I'm hoping that you could write this down and tell me how it works, please. Okay, if we are to accept the fact, let's call it a fact. Let's call it a fact that meaning or explanation can only be derived from the natural world, meaning from scientific understanding. Okay, if meaning, explanation, all of these things can only be derived from the natural world, then all conceptions of reality are derived from the natural world. Okay, so everything that we imagine, anything you can imagine in the top of your head right now, must come from this world, correct? Even if you imagine unicorns. No, seriously, think about it. Unicorn is a conception from the natural world. A unicorn is what? A horse and a horn. You just combine two ridiculous things. That's it. Right? What about a dragon? It's a lizard with wings. Right? What about a square circle? You can't think about that. But you still understand what a square and a circle are. Correct? So we understand that when we imagine things, they all come from the natural world. Okay, so let's accept the atheist, what they're saying here. Number two. If all conceptions of reality are derived from the natural world, then they must be a coherence of meaningful experiences. They must be meaningful. That's it. So everything that we think must have some sort of meaning. That's all. That's all I'm saying. You don't have to hurt yourself in that one. Number three. People believe that there is a meaningful, transcendent reality, God, that shares no properties with the natural world. Okay, this is where this gets interesting. People believe that there is a meaningful, transcendent reality. I mean, people believe that there is something beyond the natural world. We believe in Allah. We believe in something that is not this. If P1 and 2, meaning the first two premises, then P3 is a conception of reality derived from the natural world. That means that our concept of God must come from here. Right? But wait, number 5. No number of meaningful experiences can direct one to consider the possibility of something meaningful beyond said experiences. What am I saying? Wait a minute. How can I conceive of something beyond the natural world when the only thing that I can understand is from here? How is it possible for me to even think that there might be something outside when all there is here? Therefore, P3 is not a conception of reality derived from the natural world. So what is the conception of? Okay, I give you an example. Oh, I'll give you the actual answer to that. The answer is in here. In the Quran it says that you will find signs where? Where? There's two places. and in yourself, right? Okay. Remember what we understood about science? How it's a subjective construct? And how it comes from our minds? How we systematically put experiences together in a coherent fashion? So when we conceive of God, what are we doing then? Can anybody tell me? We're projecting how our mind works onto reality. Okay? What I'm trying to say is this, the fitra. The proof for the existence of God is from your own mind. That's it. Because if the natural world is all that we have to derive meaning, it would be impossible for us to think of anything that could possibly have any hint of intelligence, any hint of majesty, power. These are just relative concepts, by the way. When you hear the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these are relative concepts to our understanding. They don't actually mean, they don't actually encompass what He actually is. It's just for us to understand. So when you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-powerful, your understanding of power is from here. But of all-powerful, that's something you cannot conceive. But you still believe it. Why? So in fact, when the atheist claims the natural world is the only place that we can derive meaning, it's self-defeating. Now, there's more to this presentation that I haven't put in the slides, so I'm going to keep going. Oh, you have questions?
You just come in anytime you want to ask any question.
Interrupt me anytime because I can't talk further.
I mean, the Quran is guidance for the believer. To think of the Quran only as a book of science is fallacious. But in this guidance, in this guidance for mankind, for the believers, there could be a sense of wonderment about the natural sciences and all that. And a lot of these things, I mean, some of these things I believe are actually in the Quran to strengthen our faith. Like, for example, embryology. You know, the mudakha and the al-halaka, and then the fact that the bone and then is actually clothed by flesh, etc., you know. And therefore, these are miraculous. If you are talking about the fact that the Quran is released in the 14th century,
let me, I don't mean to, I agree with you that they're there to strengthen our faith, but not in that way. And what I mean to say, let's take embryology for example, right? Actually, the Hellenic Greeks knew about embryology quite long before the Arabs did. And it's not surprising that the Arabs would know about embryology because of their trade. What I'm trying to say is that the purpose of that ayah, of those ayahs, is not to show the miraculous nature of the physical, in the sense of, oh, we didn't know this already. It was supposed to show how much mercy Allah has, how much, you know, graciousness He has for you. That's really the purpose of it. For instance, you have an ayah. I'm trying to remember exactly. Where it says He laid out the earth flat. Okay, like a carpet. Now if you read that literally, it means the world is flat. And that's bad, because that's not true. Now, but if you read it out metaphorically, what it means is that if you think of what the Arab traders used to do in the desert, the Bedouins used to roll out the carpets, flatten out the sand beneath them so it would make it comfortable for you. And then they would put the food on the carpet. So it was making a gesture, it was making an analogy with Arab hospitality. That's a much more beautiful and much more magnificent way to read the Quran than just saying the earth is flat. Any questions?
so it doesn't negate the fact that there could be I mean, like for example, you're telling me what Greek, the Greeks knew about the mudra, and you need a microscope, to actually find out about these things, the early conception of embryology that is mentioned in the Quran. I find, you're telling me a few thousand years ago they had microscopes.
No, not the microscopes, because they were looking at it from a very, they weren't looking at it at a microscopic level, they were looking at it at a much larger level. There are still birthing sacs that you can actually view with the naked eye. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of the knowledge that they had regarding science and the world around them was relative. And if it was all a secret, basically, if it was about scientific discovery that they had not realized yet, then it would be hard for them to imagine what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying in that sense. Like they'd be like, what's going on? So the Quran says it's very clear, and that this is something that they understand very clearly. So if it was really a scientific miracle that we just discovered today, then how would the Arabs then understand it? They would have no idea what was being said.
The Quran is meant for all time, so therefore it depends on your level of sophistication at that moment in time. You get me? So these things come about, the Quran is some of the miraculous nature of the Quran could come about as it is revealed. I mean, I understand your view that, okay, I mean, it could affect your faith, and therefore you shouldn't take it at face value that the Quran is about science. But to negate it completely, I think
I understand where you're coming from. The unchanging nature of what you're trying to talk about is that the Quran is for all times and places. I agree with you for this. But the only way that can be possible, at least in my understanding, is that it must be unchanging within the context that the Arabs understood at the time, and we understand that through the Sunnah. And so basically, for instance, you have the ayah of the mountains being pegs. Okay, this is quite interesting. Now, if you experience an earthquake near a mountain, it's a very bad experience, unless you're inside, in which case it actually is quite stable. And what it might have been, that ayah might have been referring to, is the people that were not at the base, but were like within the mountain range, that is much more stable for them. So I understand. I don't think that we should completely subtract the natural world from the Quran. But what I'm trying to say is that we can't make it so complex, because it just doesn't fit in that way. I think it's not only dangerous, but I think it takes away from what the Arabs were probably actually experiencing and what they were actually listening to, and what they really grasped from it when it was being said. So, yes?
The atheists have never claimed to have the monopoly of truth or morality. Instead, many a times they appear humble, that they are prone to err. I think the biggest gripe about Abrahamic faith is that this faith claims to have absolute truth. And for us to make such a bold claim, shouldn't it be reasonable for us to let science be a form of scrutiny?
I think the concept that only one side has absolute, or claims to absolute truth, is not. I think it's a false dichotomy when you say that one side and the other, one's more skeptical, one is not. In order for us to have any sort of conviction at all, we need to believe that something is.
Then what about the lay people? What about people like us? We have not experienced it. Does it mean we do not believe in Allah yet? Until we have the experiences, that's not what it meant. It meant there are two levels of experiencing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can experience Allah with your mind, you can experience Allah with your heart, and also you can experience Allah with your being. That's another story. For people like us, is what our brother has touched just now. It's fitrah. It's just that. It is just that we can't explain it. Even they have proven themselves with the God spot. But maybe another 10 years they will say, no, there's no God spot actually. And then the next 20 years they will say, there is. Then there's no. We believe in fitrah. There is such thing as fitrah. There's deep feeling in us since time immemorial. people have believed in the existence of this higher power, higher than themselves. So the explanation for people like us is fitrah. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, and I think to simplify this argument too, let's just imagine this. We are the small creatures on this very small planet in the middle of nowhere in a massive galaxy. And for some strange reason, we can expand our minds beyond it. For some strange reason, we can think beyond it. For some strange reason, we have rational thought that can conceive of things that are much larger than that perceived reality itself. That in and of itself is a miracle. It's not an accident. It's not the product of some. If it is a product of evolution, which is, by the way, I just want to mention that I do happen to follow that theory, not to its fullest form, with the concept of common ancestry and such like this, but I do, it doesn't bother me because I don't. It just doesn't bother me. It's nothing. It doesn't conflict with my faith. But even if it was a product of some gradual or adaptive process, okay, something greater had to be able to construct the possibility of even that happening to begin with. So the fact that we have this idea that there's atheists that think, oh, we came from very simple beginnings, that's nonsense. Those simple beginnings had to have enough energy, had enough information, they had enough to even come into this complexity that we have. It's impossible to believe that we came from something so small without something driving it so big.
Any comment
On evolution? Okay. Okay, well, evolutionary theory is for me, it's not a problem. I'm not a fan of Richard Dawkins. He's a wonderful writer, but he's a horrible person. I was a fan of Stephen Jay Gould. If you've ever heard the name, he was an eminent biologist as well. He was actually opposed to Dawkins on many occasions. He wasn't a fan of religion, but he was also not anti-religious. And I think if you really want to understand evolution, you should read a lot of his works. It's actually a very fascinating, very beautiful theory. It explains quite a lot. You don't have to follow the more, say, outrageous, but more, meta claims of it, basically the common ancestry and such like this. You don't have to, but the main components of it there's nothing against our faith at all. It's a beautiful theory. It's really fascinating. So and the more you understand of evolution, you just see the beauty of creation. It's amazing. It's phenomenal.
I mean, the main issue is there are changes in all these creatures, so to speak, right? It's just that we believe it happens with intelligent design. The thing evolved to fit into the surrounding at that time. So it is not anti-religious. The point of the matter is Muslims project this thing about religiosity with the Christian basis, Oh, they are religious, and therefore for us to be religious, we must believe that evolution is something that Muslims should not believe, which is not the case.
How do you then be concerned with the theory one? I don't know.
I just don't follow the common ancestry line. But adaptive and mutations is not a problem. Not a big deal. Excuse me? Full minutes. You mean classification system? That's still very vague. I just don't. The thing is also, I don't have that much faith in science. I follow what I think is what coheres with my understanding of reality, but in general, I don't look at science as like, oh, this is absolutely the case. So whatever works and makes me understand reality in a more coherent fashion, okay, I'll follow that. But at the same time, I'm expecting science to change very quickly. That's just been the nature of it throughout history. So.
we observe that people are becoming less believing in God.
Yes.
So it's like fading. And to a certain extent, they don't realize they are actually atheists. So how does it affect, for example, in Singapore or East Nusantara region, how will it affect us socially or politically? Do you guys understand this?
No. There have been very few historical studies on the rise of atheism in certain other societies. Now, when you're talking about this is a very unsavory topic for a lot of atheists to bring up, but probably the worst example of an atheist majority societies was less than a century ago. Now, I'm not trying to say that because of atheism that this happened, but because of the belief in certain state ideologies and also in scientism itself, which, by the way, was another reason. This is another reason why scientism was also abandoned for the moral reasons. Was that during World War II, Stalinist Russia and Mao's China, etc., most were atheist, and it wasn't their atheism that caused them to do anything, but it was because of their belief in this very materialistic, very mechanistic understanding of humanity and the reality that they were able to slaughter hundreds of thousands of people. And Stalin, one of Stalin's major quotes is that one death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic. And he used to be, he's very mechanical in the way that he viewed society. And Marxist dialectic was primarily materialistic and scientistic in that way. So that was another reason that scientism was sort of abandoned during that time. But because of the lack of education, but the educational gap between the lay people and academia, history has been forgotten. A lot of the ideas that were previously refuted have come back into fashion, or have stayed in fashion, and we're actually still at, moving towards that reality again, actually. If you look at societies today, there's a corporate fascism that's going on now. People are being viewed in a very economic way. And this is very disturbing because that usually leads to something else down the line. This is not a slippery slope fallacy at all. This is simply been the case throughout history. Once you start viewing human beings for the economic value is when you start exterminating them. So.